This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless, brought to you in association with Yellowwood, providers of executive coaching, corporate training and facilitation, your external learning and development partner. Each week, we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture in your organization. Yellowwood, take a different path to success with your career, team, and organization.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining us today is Karen Eber, who will discuss her book, The Perfect Story, how to tell stories that inform, influence, and inspire. Karen is an international consultant, keynote, and TED speaker. As the CEO and chief storyteller of Eber Leadership Group, Karen helps Fortune 500 companies lead with story to build empathetic leaders, teams, and culture. Her clients include Facebook, General Electric, Microsoft, Stanford, MIT, London Business School, plus many, many more. Karen is also a 4-time American Training and Development winner and frequent contributor to publications, including Fast Company. Karen, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. We've been planning this a while, so nice to talk with you today.
It's great. And a big shout out to Lisa Bragg, who is a previous guest. Speaking of previous guests, your book, The Perfect Story, I'm going to tell the listeners why this is an essential read to anybody that's interested in presentation skills, storytelling, which I teach and coach people on. And if you're a person interested in storytelling, or if you're a facilitator or you're in HR, this is the book for you. And I'll tell you why. It can be used for anyone, whether it's in business, job interviews, weddings, eulogies, you name it. Not only just theory, but it also has important stories to how you tell them, the structure. You have checklists. There are different prompts. You interview masters of storytelling, such as the former creative director of Pixar, the TED Radio or podcast host, plus video games creators. There's so many resources in this. Karen, well done in this book.
Thank you. I wanted people to realize that they can learn to be a great storyteller. It's not a secret skill that only a few are blessed with. And I wanted to give the tools to do that.
And speaking of that, not only am I praising this book, there's other more famous people than me. And some of them are actually our guests on this show, the Workplace Podcast. So Amy Edmondson speaks very highly of it. Dory Clark, Francis Frey, so they say, Adam Grant, Dan Pink, who may be future guests. We don't know. Let's hold a spot for them. And there's so much praise for this. So definitely a book to check out. So listen, let's get into it. The cover is the way we're going to start. On the cover of the book is a green crayon, and it's a great way to start this story. And you have a story about don't eat crayon. So I really identified with this because my wife's niece has something in common with you. So if you want to tell us that story about don't eat the crayons, tell me about that.
I'm curious if your wife's niece also ate crayon. So I was born with blue eyes, like so many babies. And about 4 months, they changed to 2 different colors. So one is brown and one is green. And it is my favorite thing about myself. I have a built-in answer to that question. Tell me something interesting about yourself. You know, anytime you're filling out identification and you have to put your eye color, I don't fit neatly into the box. And I like that. And as much as I've treasured this, I've realized so many people don't know what to make of it. I can almost tell the exact moment in a conversation when someone notices because their words start to slow and you can see their brain trying to make sense of what they're seeing. Their eyes start going back and forth from my right eye to my left. And it's almost like their brain is trying to figure out, do we look at the green one or the brown one, or the green one or the brown one? And as soon as this happens, I brace myself because every time I get the same reaction, which is, do you know you have 2 different colored eyes? Which sometimes I can't help but play along with and say like, no, really? But my response is irrelevant because now we are on a one-act play that is going to play out the same way every time. Because their next question is, or their next statement is, I know a dog that has that, which I am like, okay, thank you. Like, what do you do with that? And then there's usually David Bowie. David Bowie had two different colored eyes, which I'm very sorry to say he did not. He had the same colored eyes, but one of his pupils got expanded in an accident. It doesn't matter because we're still in this one act play where they then go to questioning. What color eyes does your mom have? What color eyes does your dad have? Do you see the same colors out of each eye? Or do your eyes give you special powers? And this thing that I love about myself becomes a burden because now they're calling other people over. I'm like the sideshow in the circus where, hey, you've got to see her eyes. And I'm no longer a person, I'm a thing. And everybody wants me to like, look here, do this, do that. And it just became so draining that I decided to do something different. So the next time it happened and someone said, how did that happen? I shared that I was born with brown eyes. And when I was 4 years old, I was in my room coloring one night. And you know how we all had that box that we threw our crayons into, the broken ones and the peeled ones and the perfect ones. For me, it was an old cigar box, and I'm in my room coloring. I'm getting hungry. Dinner wasn't going to be for a while, so I reached in the box, pulled out a green crayon. It did not smell like anything, but I took a bite and it had a really interesting texture. So I ate the crayon and I liked it. And I reached in the box and ate another and another until all the green crayons in the box were gone. The next day I woke up and my left eye was green. And then I would be quiet. And people would look at me so confused because they would be having this mental disagreement of like, logic tells me there's no way her eye turns colors because of crayons. But then they're caught up in, but she said it so convincingly. Like, I don't know what to make of it. And I would let them off the hook and tell them that that is not why I have two different colored eyes. I didn't eat crayons. But this shift happened because they would start laughing and we would have a connection that we probably never would have had otherwise. They realized, they actually asked me, do you see different colors out of each eye? And that they were asking these silly questions. And we were able every time to move that conversation and interaction to a different place. And I found that the story allowed for me to reclaim the energy and create something that was meaningful in even the most inauthentic of situations. So I do like to say that my eyes do give me a special power of storytelling because it's something I learned early on that can just make all the difference in interactions.
And this is the beauty about this book. So that little story really encapsulates a lot of the story structure and the model that you've structured this book around. So I really like that. If you talk about the book, then you talk about in the book, it's part art, it's part science. Can you tell us more about that? I'm intrigued by that concept.
I believe that it's not enough to tell a story. The way you tell it is going to make a difference in the experience. And there is science that validates that. Some of that is the brain activity that we have as we listen to a story, engaging our senses and using more of our brain. And there's this term neural coupling, which means that as the person experiencing the story, my brain is going to light up in the same pattern as the person telling the story. So there's all of this research around things like that. But more importantly, while that's interesting, that doesn't tell you what to put into a story. So I believe there are what I call the five factory settings of the brain, that these are different choices in how you're telling a story that make a difference in the experience. And these are things that cause the brain, the person, to pay attention and remember and interact with the story, or it causes it to be lazy and maybe half listen or wander off somewhere else. So while stories are an art, there is truly a science behind the choices that you're making and how the person is going to experience that.
That's a piece that I found really interesting in the book. Then you talk about the pattern interrupt. So is it okay if I quote from the book as well? So when you talk about the five factory settings there, is it okay if I quote directly from the book?
Yeah,
Page
sure.
32? Yeah, okay. So storytelling is the musical conductor of neurochemicals. A great story can create a crescendo of pleasure neurochemicals. It can also amplify the feeling of discomfort or decrease it and quiet it to avoid pain. These directly impact how we process information and make decisions. Stories that include uncomfortable moments help you consider what you can do to navigate or avoid them. And those that leave you in a wave of joy and warmth can reinforce the choices, actions, and values in the story. That one little piece of 140 words or less is brilliant.
So I have a TED talk on storytelling, on what happens in your brain when you listen to stories. And there's an opening story in that about someone that drops their phone down an elevator shaft. And I call that an uncomfortable story because even if we've never done that, most of us have phones that are a significant part of our lives. And we can just feel the sinking moment of what would happen if our phone dropped down an elevator shaft and we're then stuck trying to figure out what to do. And as a result of that story, the story is about how, as a leader, it's so important to help people feel seen and valued, regardless of their role. And it's, we can tell it if you want, but the story takes you through these uncomfortable moments that you probably have never experienced, but you do come away changed, where people tell me they hold their phones differently when they walk into elevators, or they're really more intentional in interactions because that uncomfortable moment allows for you to empathize with what's happening in the story. Think about situations that you've been in that have been similar or that you may encounter. And now it's front of mind in how you want to move forward. And so a story doesn't have to be feel good. It can be uncomfortable, or it can even be one we don't like, but it's done the job where the brain paid attention and it's gotten to that point of decision making where we vow to do something different.
And that's what I like about the book, because you go into neuroscience, you've lots of cool diagrams as well of the different parts of the brain. And what I really like then is we can sometimes forget facts, can't we? Stories stay with us for some reason. They're very memorable, and that's where we can re-access them every time we go into an elevator. Then a bit like that story. Oh, did I drop my elevator? It was down the shaft, wasn't it? And then it got, yeah, and then they retrieve. There's a big story there, but isn't it true that it's so memorable? This is why storytelling is so important. So you talked about leaders then. Like, can leaders just copy a story from someone else? Does it have to be authentic? Like, what's that thing that leaders sometimes miss with storytelling?
We always want to know, can we make up a story or can we borrow someone else's story? And I would love for everyone to think of it this way: of storytelling is personal. Every time you tell a story, there's a reason why you are telling it. You are putting your perspective on it. There's something you want the audience to take away. There's a reason why you are telling it to this group. So if you told this story about this person, Maria, dropping her phone down the elevator shaft, it would sound a little different than how I tell it, as it should. Because storytelling is meant to be personal, and we're meant to bring our perspective to it, even if it is a story that is not about us. Stories don't have to be private, and each person's privacy barrier will be different. So I generally don't tell stories about my family, but I will gladly tell you a story about a time I failed or a time I blanked on the TED stage, because that isn't private. There's a reason for it, but each person's privacy barrier will be different. And so whatever story you're telling, whether it's about your experience or someone else's, you have to think about why you're telling it to this audience, what you want them to experience after, and then how you are making it personal, why you were the one sharing it. So it's less about, do I make up a story or can I borrow someone else's story? It's more, for leaders, it's more about, what do you want your audience, the people experiencing the story, to feel as a result of your story? What is that internal shift? And then what do you want them to do after? And then you can get to how you make it yours.
And that's something that you really capture in the book. It's about context, and it's really about getting inside the audience mindset before you start. How do you want people to think? How do you want them to feel? What action do you want them to take? And who are they? What are their challenges? So again, in your book, you also talk about creating a toolkit for yourself. So it's building up like a library. Can you tell us a little bit more about that toolkit? So if people are not vaguely familiar with storytelling, what would a toolkit look like?
Well, even before the toolkit, let's just build one more thing on the audience piece. Stories actually start with audiences before the ideas, because an idea without an audience doesn't have a home. And think of it this way: when you get on an airplane and the person next to you asks you what you do for work or how you spend your time, you make this split-second decision of, am I going to tell the really detailed version I might tell someone at a networking event with peers? Or am I going to tell the version that I would tell the relative that has no idea what I do for a living, and bring it up to a much higher level? The message is the same, but how you're delivering it is different. And so that is why we always want to start with the audience of how are we getting really clear on that. To support that, you do want to have this toolkit of ideas that you can refer to. And this is going to be any place that is meaningful for you to capture a list of ideas. It could be an email, an app, a spreadsheet, a post-it. You want to have a dedicated place that you are capturing ideas that come to mind that are potential stories. You're not worrying about who you're going to tell it to or how you're going to tell it. You're not even writing the full-blown story or what the takeaway is. You're just writing enough of the fragment so that when you do have that audience and it is time to tell a story, that maybe you want to tell a story that creates a shift in trust towards you or increase in trust, you want to be able to then go down this toolkit of ideas and say, which one of these can help me build an idea around trust? Which one of these can help me build whatever action that I want? And so the way you're going to get there is by going through different experiences. Think about your personal experiences. We all have had first concerts and first events, first cars, dates, vacations where things went awry, something you should have gotten rid of, but you just can't part with. And what you want to do is start working down this list of prompts to see what pops up. Often ideas that aren't even on the page will come to mind because you're getting into this creative mode. Go through your professional life. All of those questions you get asked in a job interview are great to come up with different ideas for professional stories, from mistakes you've made to moments you're proud of, best advice you've been given. Think of podcasts that you love, articles or books, or I am a sucker for documentaries and I'm always making notes about documentaries I've seen and something that I've learned in them. And so what you're trying to do is truly build this toolkit of different things that are just interesting to you. And that's the key. You want to have some fascination or interest in it, because when you're telling a story, it's an exchange of energy. And if you don't feel that, it's going to come through in the story. So you're building this list without knowing when you're going to use it, who you're going to tell it to, how you're going to structure it, or what the message is going to be, because we can think much more creatively when we're not under constraint. When we're under constraint and we're editing, who am I going to tell this to? Like, I can't tell this to this audience. I can't do it here. It actually makes it so much harder for your brain to think of things. And so create a habit and a place to capture this. And then anytime you need to tell a story, you've got this process and place to come to help find what you need.
I think that's really interesting for our listeners, that toolkit. So I'm going to share for me what I do. I use OneNote, the Microsoft app OneNote, and I have a list of stories. So I teach so many different workshops and courses, from leadership and conflict and negotiation, mediation, high performance teams, cross-cultural communication. And especially when I talk about cross-cultural communication, or when I think about negotiations, I tend to weave in stories to make the theory stick. And people are find it memorable then. And sometimes it's just a scribble where it's a movie moment and I've captured that, and it's all captured in there. And I think that's another point that you made there, was when we would talk about privacy and the personal, then is when we're trying to, I suppose, be very cognizant of boundaries, especially other people's boundaries. I wouldn't tell stories about my family or something like that, or even my clients. But what I might do is I might change the story, and let's call this person Johnny, or Annie, or whatever. So I think there's different ways around that, and this is what's so good about your book. You've so many checklists all the way through the chapters, and at the very end is this. It's just chock-a-block of resources. And that comes to mind then is when you were talking about the audience, then it's like sometimes when people are building a structure, then they say, well, speak with the audience in mind at the end. But then do you have to follow a linear structure, or is there different structures to your story? So should it always be a beginning, middle, and end, or is there a different way to structure your story?
So I think of structuring in two parts. There's the structuring that is, I'm collecting all of the ingredients so I can see what recipe I can make. I want to go in my pantry and know what I have. And then there is the, how do I put it together? What am I actually making? So building a initial structure is important because it makes you think about what the major pieces of the story are. That isn't necessarily how you will tell it. It is truly meant to be, though, how are you organizing your thoughts and making sure the pieces are there? The only time I suggest really defaulting to beginning, middle, end, if you are unsure, is if you are trying to tell a story in the moment and you've never told it before, you can at least organize your thoughts in those major pieces. There are endless different ways that you can tell the story live. Once you have the major structure and the pieces, you can start right at that conflict where there is something that's being explored. There's some tension. You can start at the end. If you think of films, Quentin Tarantino is a filmmaker that does this. You get started, dropped right in to the end of the movie, but you have no context for what happened. And so through the course of the movie, you almost go back to the beginning and retrace your steps and get back to that moment that he started at. You could start at the beginning and maybe pause a little bit and you get a flashback and gain a little more insight. The way you tell it will vary because the goal is, how do I tell this in the most compelling way so that it is building tension and it is making the listener's brain spend some calories on what's happening? And that can look different each time. What I suggest is build the basic structure, which I use: context, conflict, outcome, takeaway. And once you get that, put them on Post-its and start playing with the order. What would the story look like if you started right at the conflict? What would the story look like if you started at the end? And you can experiment and see some different ideas.
I think that's so fascinating. So when I sometimes teach people on storytelling or presentation skills, I often tell them, don't create your story structure through PowerPoint. I say create a mind map first and then do it, because then your mind map, it can be changed around. It's a bit like your sticky notes or something like that. You can swap around the story structure then to suit yourselves, or add in facts or detail. And that's something that you go into the book, isn't it? In detail, why detail is important. What's the importance of detail?
I would actually suggest never creating anything in PowerPoint, because then the slides are driving what you say versus you guiding what you want to say and having visual aids to support it. The details, so once you have your basic structure, think of this as your outline, the skeleton, you still need the muscles and the skin and all of the things that's going to make it really recognizable. And putting in really specific details that are engaging senses or helping people feel emotions, or it's just an unexpected word, it makes the audience's brain hit a speed bump. And it is like, oh, I didn't expect that. And it just is more memorable and interesting. So I was listening to someone give a talk a few weeks ago, and he used a metaphor as a detail, how he went to a fast food restaurant in the US, which has incredibly ridiculous sizes, and got a drink. And he said the drink was so big, a baby could swim in it. That's a vivid detail that's memorable. And you immediately realize, like, okay, this is really big in size. And it can be that simple. For people that are feeling a little nervous around storytelling or aren't sure where to start working in these metaphors and these specific details into your everyday conversation. And you'll start to notice how people respond to them. And what they're doing is immediately putting a fully formed image in the audience's brain. They don't even have to think, well, how big is that drink? It's like, I get it. It's big. So details are going to work that much harder for you. They're going to capture attention, be memorable. And really, it's the Jedi mind trick for the listener's brain. And it almost entices them to picture what you're talking about.
And that's what I like about what you just said there. Somebody else said that, and that was memorable for you. So it was so big, a baby could swim in it. And this is the thing that I often would say to people is, and this is why your book is so good, because you have the interviews then with all these masterful storytellers, is be a magpie. Say, now that I know what to look for, oh, I see what you did there. So is that Jedi trick that person just did there, that speaker. I think that's what people would benefit from reading this book is that they'll say, oh, I know what you did there. I could see the structure there. And that allows you then to really refine your own storytelling piece. And this is where some people might say, well, I might know the theory of it, but then they might say, well, my topic is boring. How could I create a story about that? It's boring. Could you give us any inspiration there, Karen? What do you think?
Most things are boring to us because we're so close to it. We just naturally assume that no one else is going to have interest or enthusiasm toward it. So when you do feel like your topic's boring, start to dig into the details. Who are the people involved behind it? So often the topic is about a project or people or a product. And behind all of those things are people and details. I share a story about a industrial cleaning supply company that provides cleaning tools to schools, large scale things that janitors in the schools will use. And that is not a sexy product to market. Nobody is looking for what is the coolest cleaning supply on the market for industrial size stuff. And this company, Tenant, realized this. And what they did is they launched a campaign that was where schools would be able to nominate their janitors and custodians as unsung heroes. These are the people that keep the school running, keep it clean, keep it safe, and often their work is unrecognized. Each school had to submit an essay why they were nominating their person. And the first year, the person that won was this gentleman, Chris Cantor, out of Ohio in the US. And his essay described how he knew every single person in the school by name, and that he spent his lunch hours teaching the kids how to work with tools and build birdhouses and put together all of these additional things. And it went on to say the reason he was able to do this is, cleaning supplies were working so well that his time wasn't just spent being a custodian and keeping the school safe. He was able to go and connect and really went above and beyond. And so they had a whole program called Kids with Cantor. So he won. The school received some money, he received some money, and Tenant called each of the participating schools. Now, the people that own the budget for industrial cleaning supplies are the principals, the administrators, and before the contest, they could not have told you who they bought these from, even though they own the budget. They had no idea. But as a result of Tenant calling them and thanking them for participating, I believe the conversion rate was like 20% turned into sales. And what Tenant did is they dug into the people behind their products. Who's using them? How are they using them? What is the impact of them? Anything that feels boring really isn't. I watched a woman give a TEDx presentation on asphalt, which you would think is the most boring topic of the world. And it was fascinating because she talked about how the technology behind it hadn't changed and what could happen in the future when you could build all these sensors in the road. And it is such a very cool topic because she dug into the details and made them relatable. And that's how you take any boring topic and make people connect with it. It is going to who's using it, what is it addressing, what are those impacts, because we connect with all of those things.
And that's what you say in the book. How do you resonate that story? Is there other things that listeners could do to make sure that we really connect and resonate with the audience? Does it start with choosing the right story, the right structure? What other advice that we can do to really resonate?
The biggest thing is you just want it to be relatable. So relatable doesn't mean I've experienced it before as the audience. It doesn't even mean I have to agree with it, but it does mean I know who those characters are. I understand why these characters are making the choices they would, even if I would disagree. So think about if you read a memoir. Memoirs often include painful moments, bad choices, momentous events. And when they're successful, the person is relatable. Most of the time, we've never had the experience they've had, and we would never make the same choices, but we can appreciate what they did. And then we feel we can understand it's relatable. When stories don't work, we don't relate to them, which means it hasn't been put in a context that I can understand or care about. So the best thing is have people understand, especially with the characters, why are they doing what they're doing? What do we know about them? how can we understand even if we disagree? Because then we can connect with that story, perhaps make different choices in our own life, but understand and appreciate what happened.
You talk about your 4-part story structures, and you give us, and we might go into a little more detail on that. You tell us about the context, the conflict, outcome, and takeaway, and then from Pixar, we really learn a lot about conflict there. So can you go through those 4 there, specifically that conflict one as well?
Yeah. So context is, and this is just like all the other things, right? You're writing 1 or 2 sentences for these. You're not writing the full blown story. You are truly organizing your thoughts and the pieces of the story. So context is 1 or 2 sentences on what is the setting of the story, who are the major players involved, and really why should the audience care? Conflict is going to be the heart of the story. It's the gas pedal of story. When you run out of context, when it's the fuel, right? You run out of context, you run out of story. And so this is, what is that tension? What is being explored? It could be between 2 people. It could be, in a business setting, it might be between a person and a project, or 2 projects, or 2 companies. It could be between a person and themselves, their own value. For people that do coaching, that's one that comes up quite often, where a person is struggling, something isn't quite in line with their values and they're struggling. But conflict is, what is that tension that is going to be explored? The outcome is what happens as a result of the conflict, what action is taken. And the takeaway is, what is that message you want the audience to come away with? And if you do this right, you can take that takeaway and then go back to what you defined for your audience and see, have we made a connection? Is what we said we want the audience to take away mapping back to what we wanted the audience to know, think, feel, do as a result? And so both of these are meant to be these 5-minute activities where you're thinking of your audience, and then you're working through that story structure and trying to see, like, do they connect, or do I need to go back and rework it a little bit?
And can I ask you then, when you talk about these 5-minute activities, like timing wise, how much time should I prepare to tell a story?
It's going to be different. I mean, it's different for me all the time. Some just come with ease and they flow, and you're like, how did that happen? And then others are just a struggle. And I personally do my better thinking writing it first, but the way that I write it doesn't translate to the way I can tell it. When you're telling a story, you can embody the characters, you can show the energy and the emotions, and but when you're writing it, you have to think of how to do that. When you're telling it live, you're incorporating pause, all of that. And so there's not a set formula on it. It's really, you want to center on your audience. You want to think about what that structure is, and then you want to tinker with it and really test it. That's the magic moment where this is working or it's not working, and you see what people are responding to.
My way of doing that, I have to go for a walk in the woods if it's a difficult one.
Always.
And I often speak on the podcast why I go to the woods, because it's a great place to just take it out. And I actually visualize myself saying it word for word. So I'm not really one for writing down. I'm more of a visuals, and then I do maybe a mind map and write down details. I used to play golf, but I don't do it anymore because I kept stopping and writing notes as I was going along, and I was going, "Oh, I'll include this detail or this little aspect to the story." And then we're speaking about time here, and then my mind is just wandered to, what happens if I don't think I have enough time to tell a story?
If you don't leave yourself enough time to tell a story.
Some people might say, "Well, it's going to take me 20 minutes to tell a story." Can you be really succinct in telling a story?
Absolutely. One of my clients received a phone call that he was going to present to the CEO of a Fortune 500 company in a week. And he had 5 minutes to share what he had learned about a product they were launching and recommendations for what should be different. And the implication was, get this right, and you will be remembered when it's time for promotion. Get it wrong, and you might not be promoted. And, all implied, but high stakes. You want it to be a positive situation. And the instinct, because he's the head of data analytics, is to come in and share data, to come in and share the charts and make this be the most whiz bang 5 minutes of Tableau or PowerPoint, whatever your visualization tool is. He instead sat down and first wrote out everything he wanted to say. He needed, because he's a very analytical thinker, needed to get it all out. and recognize that there was a story to start with, even in a 5-minute presentation. This was around the holiday time, and he started this story about getting down the boxes to decorate for the holidays. And the first box on top was the ornament from his daughter's first Christmas. And he started talking about that nostalgia that he felt. And the rest of the day, at the end of the day, he was headed to bed. And the product was this app that you could control everything in your home with. And he talks about how he was in bed all, with the warm fuzzies from this wonderful day, and realized that he left the lights on downstairs, turned them off, gets into the updates about the product, the recommendations. 5 people presented that day. The CEO walked up to one person at the end of it, and it was my client. And he started to share with him stories about his own children, his children's first holidays. And so the instinct is, I can't fit this in. There's no way. But I can tell you that in a 5-minute presentation to the CEO, there's not only space, it made the difference. There's always an opportunity to do it. We just fear that we're going to have to take too long. And it's really, how do you keep working what you want the audience to come away with? And how can you do that in shorter form? In something like 5 minutes, you think, I don't want to give that much time to the story when I have to cover this other stuff. But it actually made points that he needed to make for the other things. The story may work harder for you than that slide of data. And so it's having to work through the process to see, instead of, I can't fit it in, start with the story and see, how do you make that story work harder for you? And then use the other pieces to supplement it.
So I thought this next question was going to be a real doozy. I thought I was going to put you to the test. So you're telling me you can bring data to life? Because a lot of people are going to go, oh, it is just percentages and facts. And it's like boring. Like, so what is it that you can do with data then to make sure storytelling becomes a part of it? Or like, what advice would you give our listeners?
If you were walking down the street and you found 100 euros laying there, that would be exciting. That's a good chunk of money. That's a meal. That's a something, right? But let's say someone gives you money to take a trip somewhere and they say, oh, we're going to cover your expenses. Here's 100 euros. You would laugh because you wouldn't be able to, barely fill up your vehicle with that amount. And that number is a number, yet we have emotions around it with the context. And that's what you're trying to do when you're telling a story with data. The context is where we have the emotional connection and what we need to do. Charities use this quite frequently. So Charity Water is a nonprofit that is meant to raise awareness and raise funding to bring clean water, accessible water to people globally. And they have all of these statistics, like 1 in 10 people don't have access to clean water and 768 million are impacted globally. And you see this and it's just numbers. It doesn't mean anything. But when they tell you the story of John, who is a young boy about 7, 8 years old, who has to walk a mile multiple times a day to get water for his family, and this water is murky. It's water that you and I wouldn't be able to drink, but they have to use it to cook, to clean, to grow crops. If he's sick, they have to make their water stretch. He can't go to school because if he leaves, they don't get water, right? They are stuck in this loop and the community cannot move forward because they don't have access to clean water. So they tell this story and you realize, wow, I can't even imagine. I'm sitting next to a faucet. I have water right here. I can move freely because this is not a problem, let alone the disease that can be caused. And now you're realizing, and then they share 1 in 10 people globally are impacted. And you realize that's a significant number and that lands on you differently. And then you hear 768 million are impacted. And then you see the amount that can help adjust it. The number alone is going to result in different interpretations because we are each making assumptions about it based on our own experiences. But the story is going to give the context that's going to tap into, is this important or not? Is this 100 euros that's bonus money, or is this 100 euros that I'm supposed to spend on something that I really need 3, 4, 500? That's what storytelling with data is doing. It is giving meaning to the data to bring everyone to the same starting line to have a conversation, instead of what happens today, where someone will put up a chart and say, I'm not going to talk to this. The data speaks for itself. Everyone makes their own assumptions about the data. They're different assumptions because we don't know, or there's a lot of arguing about what's the source of the data, what's the quality of the data, and we're not able to have the productive discussion that's needed. And so what storytelling is going to do is give that context and allow for everyone to come to the same starting line for discussion or decision.
My understanding then is that storytelling with data then allows you to shape the narrative and shape the conversation, saying, listen, here's the problem statement. We're trying to make a decision, for example, or we're trying to make a recommendation. Is that what happens when we tell storytelling through data?
Yeah, I want to be careful with shape because people get very nervous about storytelling with data, thinking that you're manipulating. And I think you are no more manipulating than any chart you put up. I mean, it's a view of it. So I think of it as the person closest to the data bears the responsibility of bringing that meaning to others, because no one is going to be as close to it as you are. So when you are starting and sharing the problem statement of what did you set out to solve? What were you doing? And what did you do? And what did you learn? And what are those pieces that are still unclear? What you're doing is you are trying to bring that person on the journey and catch them up, because they will never be as close to it as you. And as the person closest to the data, you're going to have an insight on, is this a discussion? Is this a decision? Is this something to monitor? And you should provide that recommendation of, you're guiding people through what you did, you're showing your work, and then you are teeing up what that recommendation is. That's meant to bring meaning. That's meant to guide people. When you have the free-for-all conversations about data that end up in arguments or everyone just gives up and is quiet and some decisions are made, it's because you're missing some of that.
So speaking of arguments then, so there's some common mistakes then that people make when storytelling. So we might finish up on that. So what are the common mistakes, or where do stories go wrong?
The biggest is that we're telling the story we want to tell, and it's not the story the audience needs to hear. This is like the uncle at the holiday table that is telling that same story over and over. You can almost recite the words because he said the same story, and you don't even need to be there because he's not telling the story for you. He's telling it for him. And we will all have experiences and stories that we love and we want to share, but stories start with audiences. And so you want to think about, who am I telling this to and what do I want them to get out of it? Even if it's a story that you want to share, you want to really make sure you're making it relatable for the audience. Otherwise, it is just as uncomfortable as when your relative is telling that story over and over. Another is the stories that look a little bit like this. I went to meet my friend last Tuesday and it was raining out, and actually, I think it was Monday because I was running late and I forgot my umbrella. Wait, was it Tuesday? This is what people do all the time. It is painful for the audience. What's happening is really well intended. The person is trying to place themselves back into that moment exactly because they want to convey it as honestly and true as it happened. But the majority of those details are not important. It's not going to make a difference to the audience. And so you want to have a basic structure. You want to take the time to do that because it's not only going to help you organize your thoughts, it's going to make it easier for the audience to follow.
And what about testing your story with someone first to say, listen, I was going to tell this story, because if you're not sure of the audience, then you don't know how it's going to land. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm a big fan of testing, and I think of it like a continuum. So a story off the cuff, you don't have to test that. That telling it is the test. But the larger the stakes, as you're doing it for a presentation or an important meeting or some big speech, you want to test that story. You want to test it for a few different things of, is the audience experiencing what you want them to experience? Are they taking away what you're hoping for? Are there tweaks you can make in how you're delivering it that change the experience of it? You want to understand, what are they responding to so that you know what to lean into or what to change. There's things that you're just not going to know until you test it. And so the key is, don't just test it and say, what do you think? Because people will just say it was good, and that's not helpful. say to someone, I want to test a story with you and I'm looking for your feedback on, what is your understanding? What do you take away from this story? What resonated for you? What left you confused? Or there might be a specific piece that you're working on that will help you get a good idea of what's working or not working in it.
So you just mentioned there, and I found this fascinating in the book then. So how you deliver. So there's a lot about body language and there's a lot about energies because you say one of the mistakes is to avoid a flat story. So is there an energy arc or what happens when you're telling stories?
There's definitely an energy arc, and it's not formulaic. I can't tell you that it is going to be, a perfect arc for someone starting right at the context or the end. It might be you start really high energy and then it comes down a bit and you go back up. The energy arc is meant to do a couple things. As you're building towards the tension and the conflict, you do want the energy to get more, I'll say explosive. That might not be the right word. What this looks like for me is as I'm building to that conflict and I know I have an idea I want to land, I am going to be increasing my pace. I'm going to be getting even more dramatic in my inflection. I'm going to, you start to notice it. And then I pause and I say the idea at a lower pitch, at a slower pace. I let their brain catch up. I let them really experience the words. And so there's a bit of this playing that you do as you are preparing to tell a story live of where are you speeding up and slowing down? Where are you putting in pause right around significant ideas? How are you varying that pace and inflection? How are you using gestures to bring the audience into what you're saying? These all become these choices that can impact the experience of the story.
Aaron, that has been such an insightful podcast for people. We talk about the perfect story, how to tell stories that inform, influence, and inspire. And Karen, if people were to find out more about you and your book, how might they do so?
Best way is my website, which is my name, KarenEber.com. The book is everywhere books are sold in audio, hard copy, and ebook formats.
Karen, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been such a joy talking with you.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you found this episode valuable, please rate and review it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation, and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team, and organization.